Hey YouTube, so I'm finally putting into video a presentation that I did at my old school over a year ago because procrastination. But anyways, this is a video about classical music in Antiquity, which proudly fulfills two of my nerdiest areas apart from physics, which is music history and Greco-Roman religion or culture. Note that I underlined the word classic, so that means I'll be examining music history from a more humanities/classic student's perspective. Most of the content here, and also my interest in musicology, is drawn from the book Music in Western Civilization by Professor Paul Henry Lang. This video will also include my own digressions and connections on philosophy, literature, and theology, etc., so bear with me if there are many tangents to other disciplines throughout the video. So usually when you're a kid and you're starting to learn about music history, at least from my own experience, the teacher always starts from the Baroque period. Sometimes they may start from Gregorian chants because that's often seen as the beginning of polyphony, but focus is on these four styles and periods shown on the screen. Baroque music, with people like Bach and Vivaldi, the Classical period, which includes chamber pieces and symphonies by Mozart and Haydn, names we all know. The Romantic period tends to be the most popular, with people like Schumann, Beethoven, Brahms, etc. Towards the 20th century, it becomes a mix of different stylistic influences, like Impressionism on the rise, and also Russian composers like Shostakovich and Prokofiev who come into the spotlight. The periodization of music history is widely different from what we're taught about in history class. The connection often seems obscure or completely non-existent, but I believe that no cultural phenomenon exists in a vacuum. Therefore, when we compare those music periods to common history, we realize that the music we're taught about only spans about 4 to 5 centuries, which seemed really odd to me at first. I wanted to explore what the timeline actually looks like and what happened in the dozens of centuries before famous composers like Mozart and Beethoven. We find these huge chunks of several centuries that has been labeled by terms like classical, medieval, and Renaissance, while there's much more nuance even within those periods. So this is what I'm going to talk about today to dive into the intersection of music and history. I'll start off with ancient Greek music. I'll briefly mention ancient Rome, inspect Byzantine/late antiquity, and finally we'll arrive at the Gregorian chant, which I'm gonna end at the start of most music history textbooks. I want to start off with trying to visualize what music would look like in a world without the printing press or IMSLP. For our first artifact, we have on a stone pillar inscribed the Epitaph of Seikilos, which is one of the earliest surviving musical melodies, and also the theme music for Greece in the game Civilization 6. You can see that the majority of space is taken up by the Greek words, and musical notation is presented as footnotes or just symbols between the lines. Here's the translation of the lyrics on the screen. While you live, shine, have no grief at all. Life exists only for a short while, and time demands his due. Typical words you would expect on an epitaph. I know musicians and musicologists have made brilliant reconstructions of this piece, so I encourage you to give it a listen, whether on YouTube or Wikipedia, and this leads us into the first section of this video, which is ancient Greek music. The main question I'm trying to answer in this section is, how does music shape our ethical vision of the world? And the combination between music and how it affects our mind will come up a lot in this chapter. But first, according to tradition and philosophers that came before me, we can never talk about Hellenistic art without mentioning the two gods, Dionysus and Apollo. They're not necessarily a strict dichotomy in ancient Greek myth, but in Nietzsche's work, The Birth of Tragedy, he views them as two opposing artistic impulses that ultimately give birth to Greek tragedy. I'll borrow his paradigm to talk about Greek music and more generally the Hellenistic mindset. In ancient Greek music, each of the gods are associated with their different elements. For example, the dithyramb is one form of music that is sung and danced in honor of Dionysus. Apollo also has forms like the nome and the paean dedicated to him. The dithyramb is played by the aulos, which is a reed instrument with 2 pipes, and with people dressed up as the satyrs, where the nome, celebrating Apollo's act of killing the python, is played by the kithara, which is a larger version of the lyre. Now, just looking at the gods themselves, they have their own personalities, especially shown through their epithets, where Dionysus is described as bromius, which means boisterous, and Apollo's most famous epithet being Phoebus, which means bright. Epithets are defining traits that are appended to a character's name and is a device commonly used in ancient Greek poetry, such as Pallas Athena and Odysseus being Polytropos. If you're interested in the tosses and turns of Odysseus, shameless plug, please watch my previous video on how Super Mario Odyssey is actually similar to Homer's Odyssey. Anyways, back on topic, both Dionysus and Apollo are sons of Zeus, but they're born in different places, with Dionysus born further to the east and Apollo born in the Greek mainland. Other traits are listed on the screen, but I'll not go through them one by one. After understanding the two gods, let's shift our focus to humans. In Greek life, music is not only a way of worship, but also a way of achieving the ideal of kallikratia. This ideal combines formal beauty and elegance with moral righteousness, which in this case culminates in Greek music. Music really has the power to evoke human passions, which the Greeks knew well, so they played the aulos before going to battle to boost their morale. Another interesting fact is that the word for correct musical harmony in Greek, nomos, also means the set of ethical social values that are accepted or considered correct. Through this, they developed the doctrine of ethos, which is affirming the effect that music has on our emotions and character as far as morals and ethics. Therefore, the Greeks wanted to promote responsible citizenship with music. There are also scholars of Greek tragedy that emphasize this aspect, where the catharsis in dramatic form and art enables people to purge their emotions and make better decisions in a democratic society. So, okay, music promotes virtue, and by listening to good music, you can be virtuous. But what are we actually talking about when we're mentioning this absolute moral correctness or ideal? How can we talk about this moral virtue without noticing that the very word comes from the Latin for man, or specifically males? This Greek idea of virtue does not come without an artificially constructed dichotomy, which includes evil. What is considered evil in this context? Well, let's look at Plato's Republic. In music, there are different modes, which is basically just like the different scales or different sharps and flats you use throughout the piece. But in the ancient Greek world, the different modes are characterized by meanings and emotions, where each mode is associated with a region or tribe. For example, in this excerpt, we see that Plato highlights the different kinds of modes we must reject, and he only approves of two: the Dorian and the Phrygian, the first for war, the second for peace. And it's not hard to notice that the names of these modes come from regional tribes that are in the Greek world. By assigning meaning to arbitrary sets of pitches and deciding which ones get to stay in their idealized society, the Greeks are in fact choosing certain characteristics they want to be represented by. This is why we always see Greeks with the lyre, but rarely with the aulos, because they see the aulos as Trojan or belonging to their Asiatic enemies. Perhaps it's the piercing tone of the aulos that makes them less dignified than the lyre, which makes a more temperate and harmonic sound. Perhaps it's also because Apollo is a god of cities and quote-unquote civilization, but Dionysus is seen as belonging to the rustic and nature. This virtue is also seen as being gendered, such as the Dorian key being preferred because it evokes manly poise, temperance, and simplicity. We see this imagery persist in later history, such as Augustan propaganda. In the Battle of Actium, which is the decisive battle that ended the Roman Republic, Augustus used ample imagery to justify himself against his opponent, Mark Antony. By looking at the coins at the time, we can see that Augustus associates himself with Apollo, which is seen with his big Kythera on the other side of the coin. Apollo is the symbol of morality, law, order, radiance, moderation, which is everything that Rome might need in a time of turmoil, such as the late Republic. On the other hand, Mark Antony used things like ivy wreaths and snakes, which did not help because he was in Egypt with Cleopatra, and this rather exotic sort of imagery confirms his stance as the other, the non-Roman. Not only does Greek music constitute an integral part of Hellenistic aesthetics, it also demonstrates their socio-political views and obsession with a moral ideal that is inherently Greek. Lastly, I want to add that we as listeners are used to the music of our era, therefore it might be hard to imagine a monophonic, pre-equal temperament era of music with a modern mind. This could also be especially hard for us to imagine as English speakers, where poetic meter depends on the emphasis of words instead of vowel length, as it is in Greek and Latin. Speakers of languages that differentiate vowel length may find it easier to appreciate ancient Greek poetry and music. Thank you for staying around, and make sure to stay tuned for part 2, which will be out soon, if I don't procrastinate or get too obsessed with Deltarune. Thanks!